David Schenker was sworn in as Assistant Secretary of Near Eastern Affairs in June 14, 2019. Prior to joining the Department of State, Schenker served in the Office of the Secretary of Defense as 11th Country Director. In that capacity, he was responsible for advising the Secretary and other senior Pentagon leadership on the military and political affairs of Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, and Palestine. He was awarded the Office of the Secretary of Defense Medal for exceptional civilian service in 2005. Before joining the government in 2002, Schenker was a research fellow at the Washington Institute and a project coordinator of large, centrally funded USAID projects in Egypt and Jordan. Schenker attended the University of Vermont, University of Michigan, and American University in Cairo. Joining me today, David Schenker, former Assistant Secretary of Near Eastern Affairs in the State Department. Good evening. You are most welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
What are the strategic implications of the American withdrawal from Afghanistan?
Well, I'd say first of all, you have a new government in Afghanistan that has been trucking with Al-Qaeda and will likely continue to do so. Beyond that, I think the way in which the Biden administration chose to withdraw from Afghanistan, I think really put an incredible amount of stress on our relationship with our NATO partners who entered Afghanistan with us. We did not consult adequately with them, and the way we left, I think, was just disastrous. I think people can disagree, smart people can disagree about whether the continued U.S. military presence in Afghanistan was the right thing to do, but the way we withdraw, I think it's unanimous that it was just poorly executed.
Mm-hmm. People consider it as a shame. Do you think that Secretary Blinken provide the right answer during the recent congressional testimony concerning Afghanistan?
Well, I think the administration, whether it's Secretary Blinken or the president, I think they still believe very much that this was the right thing to do. And when we hear them talk about how they did it, they believe that this was a well-executed mission. I think leaving people behind, whether American citizens or allies of the United States, friends who helped us during the invasion, I think it was just it's hard to make the argument that this was a success at the end, the withdrawal.
How the Biden administration will deal with this new government? Will Biden administration consider it as a terrorist group? Most of them are wanted, and there is they are terrorists. They are
yeah, there are designated terrorists in the government. Absolutely, of course, there are in Lebanon as well, or have been periodically. No, I don't know how they're going to approach it. At first, they said, well, we'll have to see how the government behaves and that they want an inclusive government. And I don't know what an inclusive Taliban government actually looks like. No, I think we'll see and maybe get some clues not only about how the Biden administration will view this, but about how the international community views this during the UN General Assembly this week and next.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that the Bagram military base will be used to train these terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda to take it as a base to spread terrorism to the region?
Well, I can't talk to Bagram itself, but I don't think that there are some who suggest that this is the Taliban 2.0. That this is a new Taliban, a new and improved Taliban, a more modern Taliban. They're looking for public relations agencies. They're much better on the internet now. They're trying to present themselves in a different way. I think this is the same organization that was in power until 2001 and during 9/11. These are a group of people that are not pluralistic. They are brutal. The women are not second but third-class citizens.
Yes.
The minorities are in danger.
But can I ask that? There is some American report said that Taliban itself has nothing to do with 9/11 attacks.
Well, except for the fact that they were providing sanctuary to Al-Qaeda which was able to do operational planning from Afghanistan.
Mr. Schenker, how is China gaining from the Taliban reaching power in Afghanistan? And what do you think about the financially backup to this government?
Well, first of all, let's say that China, many suggest, and I'm not an expert in Afghanistan, but China benefited from the United States providing security in Afghanistan. This is a group of people that provided sanctuary to terrorist organization on China's border. China now has to contend potentially with Al-Qaeda again in Afghanistan. And I can't imagine that Al-Qaeda is a big fan of China because, as you know, I mean, we don't hear a lot about this in the Arab world or in the Middle East, but China is putting Muslims in concentration camps. They are wiping out the Uyghurs. This would, I think, classify for a group like Al-Qaeda or ISIS as yet another atrocity being perpetrated against Muslims. And so this could potentially make either Chinese in the region or China itself a target of Al-Qaeda. The Uyghurs certainly are not a terrorist organization, even though they're being treated like that and eradicated by the government of China. On the economic issues, listen, China doesn't give money to anybody. China makes investments, and China gives loans that governments cannot afford and puts governments in debt traps. Talk to Djibouti that couldn't afford to pay off a Chinese loan, and now they had to give a 99-year lease on a port to the Chinese. Talk to the Jordanians who have Atarat, a Chinese-built power plant that is, once operational, will lose money indefinitely, and the Chinese want their money back and looking to put Jordan in debt. There is no, from China, there is no such thing as development assistance. This is debt trap assistance.
We heard in the news that Chinese companies are not paying their debts for U.S., and this will affect the U.S. economy.
Well, we see now, one of the largest companies in China that looks like it's insolvent and certainly will create a ripple effect across China in terms of real estate markets. But once again, I'm not an expert in the global economics.
All right. Will Qatar's mediation between Taliban and the U.S. succeed? And what was the real role of Qatar dealing between Taliban as a terrorist group and the U.S. administration?
Listen, Qatar has a way of positioning itself to be of value to big states, small states, in the region, outside of the region. They have long been a mediator between Israel and Hamas. When international funds have to go to Gaza, it is Qatar that has stepped in to play this role that I think both Israel, the United States, the international community views as being very useful. In the case of Taliban, Qatar once again has, I think, positioned itself to be a mediator and has provided a space for negotiation between the United States and the Taliban that occurred during the Trump administration. These talks led by Zalmay Khalilzad that brokered, for better or for worse, the U.S. withdrawal. It was an agreement, by the way, that the Taliban didn't keep in the end.
But don't you think that Qatar took a side with Taliban and they gained time to give them support, maybe military support?
This I can't comment on. I think that that Qatar provided a service that the United States was looking for, right? You could say, in a similar way, Oman provides a service to the international community by being the locale of talks with the Houthis.
And Iran, yeah.
You know, and in previous years, during the Obama administration, for secret talks with Iran, but with the Houthis right now, which, you know, another terrorist organization.
Do you think that the UNGA meetings, we are expecting from this meeting something regarding the Houthis attacks against Saudi Arabia? Will be any punishment, any?
No, I mean, well, this administration lifted, you know, in the last days of the Trump administration, Secretary Pompeo, I was working for the secretary, and he made the decision to designate the Houthis a terrorist organization. I think it was well warranted. You saw just in early January of 2021, that the Houthis tried to kill every new member of the Yemeni government by targeting this flight of the Aden airport and the flight that arrived. If this isn't terrorist, certainly shooting thousands of rockets, missiles, and drones at civilian targets in Saudi Arabia is. But the Biden administration lifted the designation on the Houthis. I don't know how they characterize them now, but the Houthis are and have demonstrated themselves to be a tool of Iran. And so I think we can, you know, when we're looking for the answer to what the Houthis will do, we have to look at what the Iranians want them to do.
Especially the latest execution of innocent people publicly. It's a Daesh way or ISIS way. Mm-hmm. Your Excellency, Bob Woodward and Robert Costa, a most recent book, Pearl, tells of a contact between the chairman of Joint Chief of Staff, General Mark Milley, and his Chinese counterpart. Do you think that this will lead for a resignation of the top America's military officer?
Well, I haven't read the book. I mean, I've seen interviews about this. And the way that it's being explained is that these are routine contacts with the senior leadership of the second largest, you know, or perhaps the biggest military in the world at a time of transition, and that there had been potentially concerns that Chinese were misreading developments on the ground here in the United States and the potential for attack. I can't predict what's going to happen with the chairman and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We haven't seen anybody from this administration resign in the aftermath of the, I think, what we can all agree is a disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan.
But that can be considered as a...
No. I think, once again, having talks with your counterparts about your intentions is not traitorous. I think it's an attempt to ensure that there's not a miscalculation.
Mm-hmm. All right. On the other side, what are your thoughts on the America's relations with Saudi Arabia regarding the cancellation of Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin's visit to Riyadh?
Yeah, the administration said that there was just a scheduling conflict. We know that there are some stresses in the U.S.-Saudi relationship with the Biden administration. We know that early on, President Biden said that he was going to have human rights be a central element, and that the Trump administration, I think he lamented that the Trump administration wasn't tougher on Saudi Arabia in the aftermath of Khashoggi. But really, all this administration has done is release the same intelligence assessment that Gina Haspel did during the CIA, when she was the head of the CIA. They released a redacted assessment. And maybe designated one or two more people in addition to the 17 Saudis that the Trump administration designated. But what I would say is that you had a very successful visit of Khalid bin Salman, the Crown Prince's brother and the Deputy Minister of Defense. I don't know what was behind the cancellation of this trip, whether that had anything to do with the Russia meeting agreement, or what was included even in the Russia agreement. I know that there has been some concern about Saudi potential purchase of the S-400, which is the advanced Russian anti-aircraft system, which of course was purchased by Turkey, and then Turkey was thrown out of the Joint Strike Fighter program. But I've not seen the details of the agreement.
But after U.S. Taking back the deployed Patriot missiles, they reveal a new signing or a new acceptance of a new arm deals with the Saudis. So why we feel that this administration is like doing some reactions? It's not, they don't know what they want.
Well, if you look back at the final days of the Trump administration, in fact, the last year and a half, you saw some Patriot systems being pulled out of Saudi Arabia. And the administration had excellent relations with Riyadh, with MBS, with the palace. It's because these systems are, one, have to come back to the United States for maintenance periodically, right, for upgrades. And two, periodically there are other priorities, competing priorities, like the pivot to Asia. And you saw even during the Trump administration, and the Secretary Pompeo was really, I think, changed the direction of U.S. policy in this regard, that we have to do something and change our posture vis-a-vis China. They are, according to the National Defense Strategy, China and Russia are the major strategic competitors, and we have to put more resources, direct more resources at that, which means moving other assets to Asia. And so I think you've seen some systems going, but I wouldn't read too much into this, whether this is a Biden attempt to punish Saudi Arabia, whether this is some sort of reflection that Saudi Arabia is not important. No. Once again, KBS, Khalid bin Salman, was here, the prince was here. He met with Blinken. He met with Jake Sullivan. He met with the Secretary, with Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense. He had the trifecta, right? And he's not the crown prince, and he's not the king, right? Very high-level meetings. So I wouldn't read too much.
Austin cannot meet MBS for 10 minutes. This is unfair.
He met with Khalid bin Salman. We'll see, hopefully, you know, when and if Mohammed bin Salman comes, that he'll meet the people at the appropriate level.
Former President Trump is making serious predictions of the fall of USA, especially the end of its alliance system. So do you take this position or this statement seriously? Is he right? Is he wrong? And why?
Well, no, I think that our alliance system is somewhat shaken over the last 6 or 7 months. You know, our primary alliance being NATO, our NATO partners. And that's because of the lack of consulting our NATO partners who entered Afghanistan with us, and we left basically without them, without consulting them, without sharing with them the timing, et cetera, coordinating fully with them. That's because, not because of this kerfuffle about the submarines with France, but because of the way it was handled, that they were not notified beforehand, so I think, you know, this administration, I think, came to power saying that they were the adults and they were going to build back all these alliances with Europe better than before. I mean, they appear to be very challenged in how they're handling these relationships. But I think fundamentally, the interests of all the partners remain, notwithstanding the fact that the Germans have now built this national gas pipeline with the Russians, the Nord Stream. Russia remains a significant threat to our European partners and their interests, right? We see what happened with Crimea, et cetera. Likewise, I think people see the threat of China, which is why, of course, the Australians wanted to get closer with us. The British have aligned on that. So I think the fundamentals are there for these alliances to persevere. But I think there have been some dropped balls by this administration, to be sure.
Ambassador Schenker, let me ask you this: how much is the dispute between U.S. and France serious toward the Australian submarines?
Well, I think we've had our differences with France throughout the years, but really they're a great partner. They supported our independence, you know, 240, 50 years ago, and have been with us on, some major, policy challenges. Not only, 9/11, the big wars we were together. The French have participated in maritime initiatives with us vis-a-vis China that have been important and have been, I think, demonstrated not only their commitment but their courage. Listen, I think it's clearly a stressful time in the relationship right now, but I am confident that we will get over it, that we have enough shared interests and shared values that we're going to be able to move forward. But it's a very challenging time right now.
You are a key figure in American diplomacy regarding Lebanon. Can you outline the strategic situation in this country right now?
Well, it's awful. It's a tragedy. It's a self-inflicted tragedy in part, but also, of course, inflicted in part by Iran and its proxy organization, Hezbollah. Listen, there's financial mismanagement. There's a lot of blame to go around. It's enormously corrupt. The economy was built on a Ponzi scheme. Lebanese have lost their 100% of their savings through these banks. And you now have 50% of Lebanese below the poverty line, 35% who are destitute. But you're going to have 1.8 million Lebanese, out of what, 5-6 million Lebanese, who are going to be being fed by the World Food Program. This is
a disaster.
A disaster. And yet, it took more than a year after after the last government resigned to get a new government. And we look at this government, and it looks much like previous Lebanese governments.
It's the same, always the same.
It doesn't appear to be, and if you look at the Bayan Wazadi from this new government, they don't talk about restructuring the banking system. They talk about correcting it.
They only talk about begging for money. This is our
right. I think, and I hope this government, this administration here in Washington, persists in demanding, as a sine qua non, as the first thing that Lebanon has to do in order to get any assistance from the IMF is to implement reforms. And I just don't see this government as being a reform-minded government. And by the way, we still don't have an audit of the central bank. So how can you even help a country where you don't even know how much trouble they're in because we don't have a balance sheet from the central bank? They may have $17 billion in foreign reserves, according to what Lebanese law says they need to have, or they may have negative 20 billion, and we just don't know. I would go on to say, by the way, that everybody has been watching these Iranian tankers, come into the Banyas and deliver fuel.
Describe this action and can be accountable. Can Hassan Nasrallah or the government, new government, be accountable on bringing fuel shipments from Iran?
Certainly this is sanctionable, but this is not being done with the blessing of the government of Lebanon. By the way, there are 3 ships, and these ships are going to offload and drive over in trucks to Lebanon, and it's going to provide a week or 2 of fuel, maybe less, to Lebanon. This is not sustainable for Lebanon. The United States is trying to come up with other mechanisms, perhaps gas from Egypt through Jordan, even through Syria, something from Iraq, electricity from Jordan. There are other alternatives, but this is really a publicity stunt from Hezbollah. And if you look at this, Hezbollah has been basically smuggling government-subsidized fuel to Syria to make a profit and to back the Assad regime at the expense of the Lebanese people. If this wasn't done, Lebanon wouldn't have needed Iranian oil. So this is really a card game and a public relations stunt. Hezbollah is, in this case, the arsonist and the fireman. And I think Lebanese can see it for what it is.
How this new government can take action to solve these problems? Do they have?
They can pass laws and they can implement reforms. They can have an audit of the central bank that is made public. They have a firm that has been hired and has been there for a year and still can't get their questions answered. Fundamentals like the balance sheet. So you're going to need Lebanese political elites who finally put the well-being of the Lebanese people above their own sectarian, parochial, financial, selfish desires and needs.
Some analysts say that the real problem is Hezbollah armed. It's an armed state inside a state.
Well, certainly yes, Hezbollah is a big part of the problem, but they're not the only problem, right? Hezbollah is a corrupt organization that has, they had their own Ponzi scheme a couple years ago, by the way, that all the Shiites lost all their money that they had invested with this Hezbollah-related financier. But beyond that, Hezbollah has undermined confidence in the banking system by using it to launder money, right? Terrorist financing. They are doing narco trafficking, right? Selling all this Captagon and all these other drugs throughout the Arab world, making it so that countries don't want to buy Lebanese goods, right? How is this helping? So Hezbollah is a big part of this problem, but it's not just this new government that has Hezbollah in it, right? Several previous Lebanese governments have had Hezbollah sitting in the government. Everybody has made their deals with Hezbollah, right? And everybody benefits from the corruption. So Hezbollah is a major part of the problem, but they're not the only part of the problem.
Mm-hmm. Is there any strategy from the Biden administration toward Lebanon?
Well, I hope so. I see a little bit of continuity going forward. I mean, I hope that they choose to designate more corrupt people in Lebanon. I hope that they continue to designate Hezbollah and their allies for undermining stability, undermining confidence in the government, obstructing reform. I don't know if they will. Right? This is a new government here in the United States. It's already bogged down. And to be fair, they've got COVID, they had some financial problems. This is the Biden administration. They have a lot of challenges, but already they've got Afghanistan that's dominating the news, et cetera. I hope they have what we call the bandwidth, that they are able to focus on more than one thing at a time.
Describe the American ambassador in Lebanon. She's under stress and under focus, especially under attacks.
Yeah, Dorothy Shea Ambassador Shea is incredible. I think she's a great diplomat. I think that we've seen in the past Lebanese politicians, Iranian proxies or tools of Iran, like Nasrallah, attack her, try and threaten her or intimidate her, and she's not backing down. So I think that she is very impressive and doing a great job. Yeah.
What can you say about American-Emirati relations during history, not just right now, concerning the combat of terrorism?
Listen, I think the Emirates has been an increasingly good partner to the United States and the region. Now, we've had stresses in the past. I think we disagreed about Emirati involvement in Libya and the backing of Khalifa Haftar. We disagreed about the backing for the Southern Transitional Council in Yemen. There are a couple other issues that we've not seen eye to eye, but at the same time, I think we share a regional threat perception by and large, as we've seen over the past year, I think we just had the year anniversary of the Abraham Accord, and the foresight to reach out to Israel and to make peace. So, listen, all relationships, whether it's husband and wife, whether it's just two friends, they're built on common values and shared interests, but there are also disagreements from time to time.
This is normal. The UAE government has announced a new list of terror categories, mentioning 46 groups and 15 entities. How do you think about this policy?
Well, I've not studied the list in depth, but it seems to me some of these are Iranian entities, some of these are Hezbollah related. We've seen Tabaja from Lebanon, etc. Listen, I think the Emirates has a right to be concerned. They're correct to be concerned about terrorist financing. They're correct to be concerned about Iranian attempts to meddle in the Emirates. So I support their efforts to, go after entities that are involved in terrorism. Absolutely.
This list has been took in consideration from the European Union and USA. How do you?
Yeah, no, I'm sure there's been coordination and vetting and discussion with the U.S. government and with the Europeans. For these lists to be effective, you want to get buy-in from other partners and coordination. It's like a sanction, right? Sanctions, unilateral sanctions, are great, but they're not a panacea. You do much better if you get multilateral, and I think sanctions that are coordinated, that are agreed on by more than one entity, are obviously more effective.
Talking about the Abraham Accord, do you think that the Biden administration can entitle more countries to be in this list? Can do some?
Well, I hope the Biden administration is focused not only on deepening the relationships, the strategic relationships between Bahrain and Israel, Bahrain and the UAE and Israel, moving forward and supporting the connections between Morocco and Israel, et cetera. In addition to sort of deepening the countries that are already in and promoting, I think, more of the ties between Israel and Sudan, I think expanding, as you say, or broadening the number of states that are engaged with Israel, whether it is a peace treaty, whether it's part of the Abraham Accords, whether it's some degree of normalization. And further normalization actually between the traditional peace partners, right? Between Jordan and Israel and Egypt and Israel. And we saw just last week the Prime Minister of Israel was meeting with President Sisi of Egypt. They have a lot to talk about beyond Gaza, and this is one of the first public meetings in a very long time, right? You saw in that meeting, actually, I was struck, behind the Israeli Prime Minister, you had an Israeli flag, just like you have an Egyptian flag behind Sisi at the meeting. Unlike when the Lebanese delegation recently traveled to Syria and there are only two Syrian flags behind
exactly.
them. This is a sign, a little bit of normalization, and that they can talk about a broad range of issues. So I'm not going to speculate on which country will be next, but I know there are countries out there that are engaging with Israel quietly because they see it in their interests, right? And I said this when I was in the government, by the way. I think the Palestinian issue is still a evocative issue, emotional. There's a lot of support for the Palestinian cause in the Arab world. I don't deny this. But I think a lot of these governments now understand they can't be held hostage to a Palestinian government that necessarily is not capable of moving forward, or an Israeli government that might not be capable of moving forward with the Palestinians at this point, that they have to put their own interests, strategic interests, economic issues in front of this ideological issue of the Palestinians to help their own people in their own countries.
The relationship between Israel and UAE changed the face of Israel, give the Israel a new aspect, a new image in the Middle East. How does help? Because the two people are normalizing. It's not only economically, it's socially. Yeah. How do you see that?
So Israel has peace treaties with Jordan, with Egypt. And we had, for a brief period of time, Israeli tourists go to Petra, Israeli tourists going to Egypt. You don't see a lot of Israeli tourists going to Egypt. You don't see any Egyptian tourists coming to Israel, right? You don't see a whole lot of Jordanian tourists coming to Israel. You're now seeing tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Israelis going to the Emirates, and you're going to see tons of Emiratis coming to Israel. I think the people-to-people experience is what makes and builds a normal type of relation, a normal peace, right? And enables more trade, more normal relations. And I would hope there's more of that with Jordan and Egypt. But I'm really, very pleased to see this type of relationship with the Emirates so far. It's very promising.
I will take two questions from the audience because the time is running. How do you evaluate the Emirati attitude towards the Afghan refugees and their soul and the contribution with AIDS?
Well, listen, I think Qatar has been the primary node for the evacuation of Afghans. They've gone through Qatar. 30,000 or more have gone through Qatar. You've had a number that have also gone on through Germany. The Emirates has provided very useful assistance as well. The order of magnitude is much lower, and I think that the Emirates will be called upon and asked to help support and underwrite some of the work that has to be done in this regard. And many of these refugees may not be moving on for some time because it's unclear who they all are. Many of them left Afghanistan without IDs, and that they were not what they call civs, but people who had entitled to come to the United States because they had helped the United States after the invasion. These are people who were taxi cab drivers who saw that there were planes that were leaving the airport and just got on.
Also, one question from the audience. Can the new Lebanese government avoid a war on its territory between Hezbollah and Israel? Briefly.
Well, I hope so. But I think that, listen, the main thing before this government is to implement reforms. If they don't do that, they're not going to get any money. And then their second task is to bring Lebanon to elections. But if Hezbollah wants to start a war, they will start a war. This is not something that Hezbollah will consult the government of Lebanon or the Lebanese people about.
David Schenker, I thank you so much. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being in the Capital TV show.
Thank you.